Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you hear me well. My name is Danny Orbach. I teach at the Asian Studies Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I would like to welcome everybody to this series of our departmental seminars, almost the first time entirely in Zoom. And I especially welcome our guests from abroad. It's a really gratifying opportunity to share scholarship without consideration of boundaries and flights and other physical restraints. We can do it easily across the world, and I think it's really a boon. So, welcome everybody. I would say a few words about this series, and then I'll give the chair to Professor Shelach, who will guide this specific session. Uh, this is a series of lectures intended for Asianists across the board in diverse fields in Japan, China, India studies, and Korean studies. In really many diverse fields of Asian scholarships. It intends to integrate Asian scholarship from across the board and let people hear about the research of their colleagues and encourage interdisciplinary research in Asian studies. This is one of our goals. And to open the first lecture, I'll give the floor to Professor Shelach.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Um, First of all, I guess this is one of the largest seminar we ever had, and for sure the largest international audience. And this is in small part maybe due to the fact that this is the first time we do it on Zoom, large part because of our first lecturer, who is a well-known scholar. We all know him, but I will introduce Yuri anyhow. So Professor Yuri Pines is Michael Lipson Professor in Chinese Studies at our university. We are very proud. Publish very extensively, as again, probably a lot of you know, have 8 monographs, another 8 edited volumes that he is part of the editing team, and something like 90 papers in journals and edited book, amazing amount of publications. Yuri started his work on the zhuan in his doctorate research and first publication. Maybe this talk is a kind of coming back to this issue of history, early historiography of China.
I can't hear.
You cannot hear? Can you hear?
We can hear you well, Gideon.
Okay. So maybe this research is kind of coming back to the same topic of historiography, but Yuri deal with a lot of other issues, political thought in China. I think he's maybe the leading, or one of the leading scholars internationally, including in China on this subject. But he had other things as well, including maybe I will, where is my page? Mention one publication, which is the Everlasting Empire from 2012, which deal with the entire tradition of political culture in China or imperial China, including up to today or lesson for today. So it's very wide and extensive, and this is part of Yuri's personality for sure. And his last publication, his last book in 2020 with the Columbia University Press is about issues related to what we will hear today, the epigraphy and the new discovered manuscripts. So really a very wide range of topics, and we'll hear something today. Just before I give the floor to Yuri, Yuri will present the talk for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answer. I will say a few words, but I don't know if I have a lot of things to contribute myself. But if you have any question, please write either personally to me or to the entire group via the chat function, and so I can see who wants to ask questions, and or you can, once Yuri finished his formal presentation, you can also raise your hand or send me a note, and I will give you the right to speak. So this will be the way we will conduct this. And I think it's nice if people open their cameras. It's nicer to talk to faces and to kind of incognito. So, but I give the floor to Yuri.
Thank you very much, Gidi, and thank you all for coming, because I am very excited. You know, I see so many friends from so many countries. Some of you are now early in your morning, and some of you now are late in your evening, and I hope very much that you shall enjoy. And I really, really am very much excited, and I'm thankful for my colleagues, for Dania, for Gidi, for organizing this event. Okay, without wasting time, I want to explain what I am going to do, and it is related to the idea of Wang Guowei, of one of the greatest Chinese intellectuals of the early 20th century, who just committed suicide 93 years ago. Wang Guowei made a great breakthrough in early Chinese, in general in Chinese historiography, especially in early history of China, this idea of dual evidence, that you use unearthed materials to check, to clarify, to verify the reliability of transmitted texts, and you use the transmitted texts to clarify, verify, understand the materials which were unearthed. This idea, which for Wang Guowei, of course, was primarily to see what really happened, what are the facts on the ground. I think that this idea can be very well used in order to ask broader questions today, because in the time of Wang Guowei, it was 1 century ago, and of course the number of new paleographic sources was very limited in comparison to what we have today. And now we have this huge paleographic revolution, and we can ask entirely new questions. We can open new fields. And one of these new fields of inquiry is the field of historiography. Historiography, of course, is an essential problem, because, you know, if you want to ask what happened in early China, before we ask what happened in early China, we must to answer whether or not the sources on which our narratives rely are reliable sources or not. And early Chinese historiography is a riddle, is a very tough riddle. There are two actually major questions which are related to this early Chinese historiography. When I speak about early, I speak about pre-imperial, pre-221 BCE. Liang Zichao, another great intellectual, another contemporary of Wang Guowei, he made these two quite problematic statements, or maybe acceptable, but surely debatable. One is that of all disciplines, of all academic fields in China, historiography is the most developed, and worldwide, Chinese historiography is the most developed. And then the second one, before Sima Qian, before 2nd century BCE, China did not have historiography per se. Now, let me not discuss now the first of these two problematic statements. Let me focus on the second one. Immediately, when I gave these talks in China, of course, as well, immediately people feel very uncomfortable. How can he say it? But actually, when we look at the entire corpus of transmitted texts, then there is something very interesting. We have dozens of texts which are somehow related to history, which somehow narrate stories from the past, which somehow discuss what happened, but none of them are really historical. They are quasi-historical. They are anecdotes, anecdotal collections. They are speeches of famous statesmen, the canon of documents, etc., etc. But we have only one text, the single text before Sima Qian, which does what traditional Chinese historiography did for the next 20 centuries to tell a lot of details of what happened, and also to add all these interpretative, didactic, etc., layers. And this is the Zhuan. And Gidi is right that I am coming back to my PhD to a certain degree. Now, Zhuan, as I shall speak, and as most of you know, it is extremely controversial text. There are huge debates about whether or not it is reliable or not reliable. And Liang Qichao, his mentor, Kang Youwei, dismissed Zhuan. So for Liang Qichao, Zhuan was not a reliable text. And as a result of this, he said there was no historiography at all before Sima Qian. Now there is a second problem, which is even more important for us. And this is, again, the debate which started at the same time of Liang Qichao and Wang Guowei. There was a little bit younger of them, Gu Jiegang, who was not at Tsinghua, who was at Beida, and who attacked all the traditional historiography. For him, the entire corpus of early Chinese historiography, of course, primarily the Zhuan, they are the production of competing thinkers who invented the narratives, who created the stories which fit their ideologies and which fundamentally are not reliable. That is, all or most of these texts are not reliable. They are didactic texts. They are not real historiography. And then almost some 70, 80 years after Gu Jiegang, another great scholar who passed away just last year, Li Xueqin, he wrote his famous manifesto, Going Out of the Age of Doubting Antiquity. Because now, according to Li Xueqin, we discovered enough evidence to show that fundamentally early Chinese texts are correct. And there is in China now the problem, which I always challenge colleagues in China, that people overtrust some of the texts, especially the records of the historian, the Sima Qian's Shidi. For many people, they trust it very much. Now, I don't want to criticize neither Gu Jiegang nor Li Xueqin, because I think that both of them were great scholars. Both of them had a lot of very good things to say. The only problem that we cannot use this one-size-fits-all approach. We cannot just say, okay, I have proven that Zhuan or some segment of Zhuan is reliable, or that some segment of Zhuan is clearly manufactured history, which has nothing to do with what really happened, and then say, okay, this means that the entire corpus of historical text is either reliable or not reliable. I think now, with the dozens of new discoveries which allow us to revise all what we thought about early historical texts before, we can ask the questions. Every text, who had written it? For which audience? What was the goal of the author? And then we can see that there are different genres and subgenres, and there are different ideas in different texts, and some texts may be more reliable, and some texts are clearly not. And the most fascinating issue that now finally we are able to go ahead, to go out of the endless debates about Zhuan and use new materials, use new data to try to shed the new light on all these questions. What I'm going to do today, hopefully maybe I shall have no time and will skip number 4 or number 5, but fundamentally these are my ideas. I want first to present you my views of major trends in early Chinese historiography. Please, these are only heuristically convenient trends. It is not that every text can be classified into prescriptive or informative or interpretive or whatever history, but it is useful just to let our discussion advance. Then I shall discuss Zhuan, especially not Zhuan itself, but the sources which were utilized by Zhuan. And I think that it is a crucial issue of debating the Zhuan in its nature. Then I shall introduce two of the recently discovered texts, the Xinian and Chunqiu. And then I shall go to maybe a little bit to the didactic anecdotes and shall finish, I hope very much to have enough time to finish with this maybe provocative idea that there was the demise of informative histories when we go to the Warring States period. But let us start. Let us start with what I believe, and it is not in my book, it is actually the part of my ongoing rethinking of all these materials. I think that there is a subgenre which I call it prescriptive and not descriptive history. Prescriptive history is not related to what happened, but to what should have happened. It is a little bit, some of the modern newspapers are sometimes delivering not real facts, but prescriptive facts, what should have been, what should have happened. The idea, of course, is very clear, is very closely related to the crucial idea in early China, the idea of heaven's mandate. I know that we are here, some people are more knowledgeable than me on the idea of heaven's mandate, and some people here are outsiders. So just a brief reminder, the idea that there is a supreme deity, heaven, which supervises everybody and especially supervises and controls and directs the political order in the way that it becomes a moral political order. Very nice idea. Very nice idea, and then there is a problem. You know, Chinese were great in inventing political ideas and great in creating political systems. They were not good in creating religions. You see, speaking from Jerusalem, and when going back to the Zhou texts, you ask why nobody said, I am the prophet. I am the prophet. I have yesterday dreamt about the Lord on high, and he told me, do so and so and so. In China, this idea, which is in Jerusalem, as most of you have seen the life of Brian, so you know that we are here in the city of prophets. In China, this was not the idea. And that is why, although we have some texts which are very reminiscent of the Middle Eastern religion, this revere it, heaven is clear-sighted, don't say that heaven is too high, it exalts and degrades human affairs, it constantly watches at us here, great. But seriously, there were no scriptures in the Middle Eastern aspect of this idea. There were no prophets. There was no clarity about what heaven wants or not wants, except that we had one example of heaven's intervention in politics, the overthrow of the Shang dynasty by the Zhou dynasty. Great. But you know, if it is only one example, it is not enough. And I think, and it is of course not my idea, but of a great amount of scholars before myself, that in order to bolster the credibility of this heaven mandates theory, the Zhou leaders created another story, that before the Zhou overthrew the Shang, and the Zhou really overthrew the Shang, it is absolutely reliable story, they created a same story in the past, that once upon a time, Shang also did it to the previous dynasty, the Xia. The history became here the foundation of the entire socio-political order, and the entire morally guided socio-political order. Now, I know that we have here a lot of scholars, and some of them don't like the idea that Xia is an invention, and I don't want to debate it. Maybe Xia is not an invention. Maybe Xia existed. I actually, frankly, I don't know. I think there was some political entity called Xia. I think that almost surely there was no chance that the Xia, oh, sorry, one second. My battery is going. Just sorry for a second. Okay, hope my computer will not collapse suddenly. Okay, the Zhou idea was that Xia, actually the overthrow of the Xia by Shang parallels the overthrow of the Shang by Zhou. I think it is absolutely non-true. But even if we don't speak about this, there are other texts which speak about heaven's mandate, and I give you an example here. There is one of the chapters of the Canon of Documents, and it speaks, there were great kings. One of them enjoyed rule for 70 plus years, the second for 59 years, the third for 30 plus years. And thereafter, nobody enjoyed longevity. Some reigned for 10 years, some for 7 or 8 years, some for 5 or 6 years, some for 4 or 3 years. Which means if you are good, heaven gives you longevity. If you are bad, no longevity. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. It is absolute nonsense. Now we know that the late Shang kings reigned on the average 25 years each. Now, maybe the authors of this document did not know, but those who put this document into the canonical collection, the canon of documents, they should have known. They should have known. And they did not, it did not matter for them. They did not bother because the idea was what should have happened, not what really happened. That heaven is really the supreme deity. This is an important, this is a prescriptive and not descriptive history. Now, let us go to something radically different. Radically different, informative histories which tell the story. Who, what, when, and where. And I shall give an example of the very tough texts. I think that I saw that Neville Ann is also here. She wrote an important dissertation and then many articles and books about this text, the Springs and Autumns Annals, the Chunqiu, the canonical text attributed to Confucius, but I am not going to discuss this attribution at all today. When you read this text, and this is on my handout number 1, but I shall show it in a minute. When you read this text, yes, it is very informative. Despite its brevity, it tells more or less accurate stories, and we can check some of them because there are stories of eclipses and they can be proven more or less. There are mistakes, there are inaccuracies, but fundamentally, this is the text which is grounded in records of historical events. However, don't run and say, this is a real history. It is a very odd text. It has the rules of concealment. Some bad events are not to be narrated, or some events need to be presented in the way that we shall believe that the ritual system of the Zhou dynasty still works very nice. We just invent the story, and you not invent, but we arrange we modify the records in the way to prove our point. Also, the text is extremely difficult to read. Extremely difficult to read. Just you have it, those who printed out the handout and those who don't, I give you for a second. You see this narrative. How can you understand it? Sorry. Okay, the first year, spring, king's first month, nothing else. What it is about. We know that it is an important narrative that something is omitted here, but actually there are a lot of these empty seasons, or you can see in the penultimate number, in winter in the 12th month, the Jai Earl came. Who is the Jai Earl? Why he came? Where did he come? Why is it important? Nobody can understand it. So you have here a very strange text, no narrative, no interest in causality. There is no question of why. You have a lot of details, but you absolutely don't understand what all this is about. And there are 65 records of seasons, which are empty records. No information at all. Spring, the first month, or summer, the fourth month. Very nice. Should they not write, I will think that in this summer, there was no fourth month. So who were the audience? I have my guess. I don't go to discuss it. It is just my guess. It is hypothesis. You can take it, you can leave it, you can explain it. Otherwise, my idea, the text was directed primarily at the ancestors, that it was put in the ancestral temple. And originally, the readers were the spirits of the ancestors of the ruling family of the state of Lu. The text itself was not comprehensible as it is, because it was not meant to be comprehensible as it is. And it is not only for us. It is not that we are not good enough. In the Han Dynasty, one of the greatest intellectuals of the later Han Dynasty, Huan Tan, he says, Should the classic, like the commentary, should we have the Chunqiu without zhuan, the sage would close the door, ponder over it for 10 years, and even then he will not understand it. It is really tough. Now, let us put it aside Chunqiu. Do we have other example of informative histories? Actually, we do. Among unearthed materials, there is one of the very interesting inscription, the Jin Hou Su-bianzhong. There is a long story and you are not supposed to read it. Just look at it for a second. Nobody will go to read it with much interest because it narrates a war and it narrates events over half a year, 6 months. And you know on which day what happened. The king went from this place to that place, and the Marquis of Jin went from this place to that place. And there was a small battle in which the Marquis of Jin cut off 120 heads and captured 23 prisoners, etc., etc., etc. Now, no didactic value at all. No explanation. We don't know why there was a war. We don't know anything about the background. We don't know anything about the results except that the Marquis of Jin was commemorated or was awarded by the king, by the Zhou king. Who wrote it? First of all, I believe that this text is based on simultaneous records. Somebody was accompanying the army and every day recording what happened. And now, for whom? For which purpose? I believe that the idea was possibly to commemorate these events later, because, you know, if we achieved something great, we want to remember every second from our great achievement, possibly. Second, it is very important as a later record of the merit of those who attained merits on the battlefield. And even after 3 generations or after 5 generations, I can say to the king, remember, my grandfather, he fought for you and he killed so many enemies. It is recorded in the archives. And in Zhuan, indeed, we have this sentence that the merits are preserved in the royal family and are in the archives. So I believe this was one of the reasons for historical records, and this provides the factual skeleton of histories. The later histories are all based on this. But as we shall see, these informative histories, they will not become the mainstream after some time. What will become the mainstream is the third type of history, the third genre, which is didactic anecdotes. No need to discuss it very much because really everybody who is a little bit interested, David Skaberg wrote an excellent discussion. I agree with 95% of this 5%. I disagree, I shall explain on this 5% later, but fundamentally an excellent explanation, short stories, usually with a speech by a wise statesman or a later observer, and then we understand why. The major idea of these anecdotes is to explain history, to teach you historical lessons, sometimes also to entertain. No, don't forget, Li Wei reminded me very well that it is not only to teach lessons, it is also to make a nice reading. Why not, actually? So these are the major questions for the anecdotes. Why? But much weaker on all the information, who, what, when, and where. I shall not waste your time now. We shall go to the anecdotes by the end of my talk. I want now to start with a major text, the Zhou. Now, Zhou, the Zhou tradition or Zhou commentary on the Springs and Autumns Annals on the Chunqiu, it is, of course, by far the longest and the most controversial text in the entire lore of pre-imperial texts. It is everything. You have a lot of historical information, you have a lot of interpretative devices, a lot of entertainment, not a lot, but some entertainment as well. And the text is debated for at least 20 centuries. And I also took part in these debates. And so many questions were, or so many ink was shed in order to discuss, does this text comment on the Springs and Autumns Annals or not? Who wrote the text? Is it this traditional author Zhou Qiuming or somebody else? And when the text was written, when it was composed, 5th century BC, 4th century BC, 3rd century BC, maybe 1st century BC, etc., etc., etc. Now, ladies and gentlemen, all these questions are important, but before we start to discuss these questions, I believe we must discuss something most essential. What are the sources? How the author or the composer of the Zhuan knew what happened for 242 years of the history of the Springs and Autumns period. Now, early scholars, they did answer this question. They answered, they said, yeah, there were local histories, the state histories, the guoshi. And I do think that it is a very good start for the discussion, but what were these state histories? Nobody could answer. Nobody could answer for a very clear reason. None of these early histories survived. You see, when we discuss Sima Qian and his historical records, we can know some of his sources. For instance, we can take Zhou Zhuan, which was utilized by Sima Qian, and see how did he utilize his sources. In the case of Zhou Zhuan, except for the annals, we don't know anything about its sources. None of them survived. And here, the paleographic revolution changed the story. But before we go into the paleographic texts, I can show you that even from reading Zhou Zhuan itself, you can have first hints about the immense complexity of this text. And I shall start with the most boring part of Zhou Zhuan. In the first year of Zhou Zhuan, you have 7, I did not put all of them because of the size of the slide, but you have it on your handout. You have 7 entries which discuss whatever events of really marginal events, but the only unifying thread of all these events is they were not recorded. Something happened, it was not recorded. Now, you can say all these events were invented by the author of Zhou Zhuan. Theoretically, I cannot prove you that they were not invented by the author of Zhou Zhuan, but you have here some details which really very, very odd. Nobody will invent the exact day of the month in the winter, in whatever months, on Gengshen Day. Something happened, it is not invention. I believe that these materials were the drafts prepared by the court scribes of the state of Lu, who were also preparing the Springs and Autumns Annals. And I believe that these scribes recorded all the relevant events, whatever is important or whatever is not important. And then perhaps by the end of the year, they had to decide this event is important, so we shall put it into the annals. And the second event, which is not important, we shall retain it into the draft. By the draft, because if you want to train future scribes, they need to understand what is considered worth of inclusion and what should be excluded from the annals. So we need to have some draft materials. And I believe these draft materials were kept, of course, not only in the state of Lu, but we know that these annals more or less were composed in every major state. So the draft materials were also in every major state. And I believe they were the beginning of history writing, or at least they provided the historian with a skeleton, with a factual skeleton of events. You could include it and you could not include it. Sometimes in Zhou Zhuan, rarely, but we have long narratives which are full of details. Here is one of them, a crazy narrative. This is really a crazy narrative because it speaks about a rebellion. Now, come on, we are not interested on which day, which army camped somewhere. It is just to give you a feeling, because don't waste your time on reading all these details, of course. To give you a feeling, we want to know who took Pennsylvania, Biden or Trump. But instead of this, we shall now get the information about every county in Pennsylvania, how many votes were for this and how many votes were for that. And we say, we don't care. Most of us foreigners, we even don't know whether Pittsburgh is in Pennsylvania or in Nebraska. Sorry, Giti. But we just want to know who won the elections. We want to know whether the rebellion succeeded or failed. Instead of this, we have dozens, and it is really page after page in Zhuan. You read these very boring events, very boring, boring to death. Now, who recorded them and for which audience? I think that now those of you who live in Pennsylvania are very much interested in what happened exactly in every county in Pennsylvania. Or those of you who are political activists of the Democratic or Republican Party, you are very interested in these details. The next generation will not be interested, but maybe for the participants in the events, for the Zhou nobles, for the descendants of the Zhou nobles who knew very well the geography of the Zhou royal domain, this narrative mattered. Why it was preserved in the Zhuan is a very interesting topic, which I shall not discuss now. Steve Durant has a forthcoming paper which will discuss some of this as well. I don't want to speculate now, just remind you. This type of narrative, it exists in Zhuan, so we have informative histories incorporated into Zhuan, but as everybody knows, or everybody who for once ever opened Zhuan knows, this is not the entire story. Zhuan is read and is admired for at least 22 centuries not because of these analytic dry things which cause you go to bed immediately. Sorry for Chinese students who are now late in the evening. Zhuan is very rich in nice stories, interpretation, why things happened, historical lessons, and Louis and David Scaberg wrote, each of them, a great monograph that you can read and you can understand all the sophistication of Zhuan. Now, for sure, some of these stories cannot come from records of the scribes. No chance. The ghost stories, the stones which speak prophetic dreams or prophecies when somebody says a very nice speech and then he says, yes, and we know that you will fail, your majesty. And of course, we know that his majesty will fail after a few years. There was no real prophets. So these stories don't come from reliable simultaneous records like the stories which I discussed in the previous slides. And here is the crucial question for Zhuan. Who merged these reliable and non-reliable aspects together? Who put them together? The author of the Zhuan, the composer, compiler, whatever, of Zhuan, or compilers, composers, at whatever period of time after the end of the Zhuan narrative, or maybe the authors of the early sources. The local histories already contained nice narratives and dry narratives. And I shall start with exposing very briefly the Zhuan version of events. When we go into Zhuan, this very nice story of Prince Chong'er who goes to exile and who spends a lot of time in exile. And there are a lot of very nice stories. Yes, once he doesn't want to leave his wife and his wife conspires with his uncle and then he's drunk and he's smuggled out of the state and he's angry. Surely, very nice narrative. Hero journey, as Steve Vai and David discussed in their translation. It is not a reliable story. It is somebody's memories. And these memories are not innocent memories. They are not just to entertain. They tell us, they explain the patterns of the Jin foreign relations. They also allow us to understand some of the political messages of Zhuan. But then in the middle of this very engaging, very nice narrative, we have once again this very dry, Very odd story. Why do we have it? I believe that we have it because this should have been the crux of the story. The Prince Chong-er, the fugitive prince, comes back to his country, kills his nephew, and establishes his rule. And I think that it was very sensitive for the scribes in the state of Jin to narrate what really happened, because if they narrated close to the events, somebody betrayed the ruler. Somebody, the Chong-er, he came originally not as a legitimate ruler. He was a puppet of the foreign power holder, the ruler of the state of Qin. So in order not to speak a lot about sensitive issues, you just give technical details and you have the narrative without any sensitivity. You know, sometimes newspapers, when they narrate something which is very sensitive and they don't know how to provide nice interpretation of the events, they just narrate the facts. You have a lot of facts, but you don't understand why. You know that somebody's IPO, or whatever, some major decision was made, why it was made. We want to understand why. No. So here, suddenly, there is no why. Now, is it the merge of this very nice, seamless merge? Was it prepared by the author of Zhou? I don't believe. No chance. It is too seamless. And it is the entire story of Chong-er. We cannot go into details because we have more of things to discuss, but I believe very strongly that all these things were there by the time, two centuries later, when the composer of the Zhou took different local histories and put them together, which means that local histories contained both informative, interpretive, interpretative, and entertaining layers. Now, this is my preliminary conclusion, but now let us go into something completely different. Something completely different. Let me start with promotion. I have just received this book yesterday, very nicely, of the Columbia University Press. They sent it just in time for me to demonstrate that it exists now really in paperback, and you're welcome to buy it very cheap. Now, Xinian. Xinian is, since I wrote the entire book about it, I will speak about it only 5 minutes because otherwise it will not be fair. It is a very interesting text. It is the first historical text which not systematically, but relatively systematically covers the history from the Western Zhou to the beginning of the Warring States period. Each segment tells the story very nicely from the beginning of the end of how the state of Chu maintained its relation with its friends and enemies. There are a lot of debatable issues about Xinian, including that it is not an archaeologically discovered text. It is a looted material. I shall not discuss it here. I shall not discuss now its reliability, its authenticity. I do it in my book. I shall not discuss the new facts about the Zhou history, which are in Xinian very interesting, very engaging. We don't have time. I want to focus on only one thing. 2/3 of Xinian parallel the Zhou. And when we compare the two texts, we can understand much better their common sources. Why common sources? It is not incidental parallels. I shall show you one slide in Chinese, but you have in your handout also in English. I show it in Chinese on purpose because you can see on the left, Xinian in blue. I highlight what is different in Xinian in comparison to Zhou, and in green, I put the Zhou parallels, which are a little bit different. Now, immediately, even for those of the audience who don't read Chinese, you immediately understand the black is the same or more or less the same. This kind cannot be coincidence. It cannot be that just two people tell a story, a nice story about the quarrel between two states, and then the state of Chu intervenes into this quarrel and eliminates one of the states. But I don't bother with the content. I say they're so close that it cannot but come from the same main joint common source. It is theoretically possible that Xinian cites the Zhou, or if you want, the Zhou cites the Xinian. Trust me, this is not the case. Now, they are very close, but the ending is completely different. The ending of the Zhou story, they have two editions. One is a very touching story of the femme fatale who was Sigui, who was captured by the king of Chu. Because of her, all the quarrels started. And then her husband was killed by the king of Chu, and she married the king of Chu, gave birth to his 2 children, but never spoke again because she wanted to punish herself. One wife serving 2 husbands. Very nice story. Li Wei discusses it very nicely. And then we have the didactic summary of the nobleman of the narrator of Zhou. When you go to Xinian, nothing about this. No didacticism, no entertainment. You just have technical detail. The state of Chu started its expansion northward with this event. It is completely, it is indifferent toward didacticism. It is not to teach you lessons. It is just to show you what happened, why the state of Chu and how the state of Chu started its expansion. And it is just one example of these parallels. I have another example, which is only on handout. I cannot put all this very long handout here, but you will believe me. There is a story in Xinian which parallels 20 years of Zhou, and there is another story which parallels 100 years in Zhou. And on the handout, you can see it very well. Every segment of Xinian, every single sentence has parallels in Zhou. So it is impossible that somebody incidentally creates 2 narratives which are so much the same. The difference that Zhou is much more detailed. And of course, there are a lot of predictions and entertainment and whatever you want. In Xinian, you have only the factual skeleton of events, but the skeleton is so nice as if you took out of Zhou some extracts and made it. And sometimes, very rarely, the authors of Xinian make mistakes. So here I have a mistake, a sentence in Chinese or in English that Li Ke killed Si Qi, killed one prince, and established Si Qi's younger brother Dao Zi. Actually, it is not Li Ke who established Dao Zi, but Li Ke's opponent, the lady Li Ji. However, the subject here, before the Chinese R, the subject is missing, which happens when you inaccurately summarize somebody else's story. It is a clear proof, in my eyes at least, that the authors of Xinian utilized some source, made mistakes sometimes, usually did not make mistake, but very clearly they worked with an early source. And I think this is the same source which was utilized by the Zhou. Here, the history of the state of Jin. So, to summarize the point of Xinian before I shall have enough time to finish what I wanted, to summarize the story of Xinian very briefly. First, it and Zhou rely on common sources. You will have to trust me, I'm sorry, if you wanted Q&A, and I shall explain why I believe that it is not one text cites a second, but both of them have this major source. What Xinian does is not for the sake of didacticism, not to interpret history, not to teach you historical lessons. It is to provide some working knowledge about ups and downs in the history of the state of Chu. And this working knowledge, I believe, was very good when the traveling diplomat from the state of Chu wanted to debate something of the past, and you want to say, remember, your lordship, 20 years ago, we made the peace agreement and you violated this agreement. Now, not every traveling diplomat knows all of the history, so somebody prepared for him a short resume, a short account of major events in the past relevant to the state of Chu. This is my guess. You can disagree. I shall be very glad to have any other interpretation. It is just a guess, but this is what I have to say about Xinian. Now, Xinian is not the only one of these newly discovered texts which are informative, because Xinian is informative. It is much more about, it is not a lot of details, but it is much more about who, when, what, and where, rather than why. We have another example, very odd text, very odd text. Very short. It tells the story of the history of the state of Chu. The major focus is where did the kings reside. All the rest of the details, if are not related to the residence of the kings, are omitted. We have some introduction to the peculiarities of the state of Chu, why the people of Chu are called Churen, the people of Chu, why there is some local custom, and why the capital of Chu is named Ying. When you read the text, you are going to sleep immediately. It is extremely boring. It is extremely boring. You just add the king of so and so resided here and here, and then he moved there and there, and then the next king moved to the next palace, and the next king moved to the next palace. Come on. When I read this text, originally I wanted to work on it and to make maybe an article out of it. I said, no, sorry, impossible. This text is so boring that I cannot write anything about it. And I wanted to ask myself, who wrote it and for whom? So it is like the Gaokao, the examinations, the matriculation examination of the students of the state of Chu. You want to know where all the kings resided in the past 300 years. Summarize it, please. More seriously, maybe this provides some kind of information for the foreigners. Maybe the foreigners were in the service of the king of Chu, were interested in some places which could have been sensitive. Where did the king reside in the past? Maybe. It is just a wild guess. I have no idea. Now, we are coming to penultimate topic, not penultimate slide, it's still a few slides, but, or maybe it is too tiring. You know, let me skip this slide. I can go back if you want, but I want to summarize a preliminary summary. We have, I think, from the overall analysis of Zhou and of the unearthed text, some of which I have demonstrated and some of which I discuss in my book, that the major unit of historical knowledge in the past were local histories produced by the court scribes. This is my 5% of disagreement with David. David believed that it all started with the anecdotes. I believe that anecdotes were derivative from these local histories. It started with long histories, and then some people said, come on, I don't need all these details. I need to know who won the battle and why, because the good guys won and the bad guys lost. This is an important story. I shall take the anecdote out of it. The local history was not like that. It was informative plus entertaining plus interpretative. And of course, didactic as well. So these local histories were produced by the court scribes, who produced also the annals and who produced also this draft from the annals. And now we know, incidentally, that there were much more informative histories in the early period, because before we had only the annals and small segments of Zhou, which not everybody was interested in. When great scholar Burton Watson translated the Zhou, he just skipped all these dry segments because it is not interesting. He wanted to show that Zhou is a nice narrative history, so he did not bother himself too much with the dry stories in Zhou. But we have it a little bit in Zhou, we have it in the annals, but this was not enough. Now, with the new discoveries, we know informative histories were the mainstream. They were produced, they were utilized for different goals, commemoration, ritual, political needs. But then something happened. It's for Gide, the transformation from Bronze Age to Iron Age. I don't know whether it is related or not related, but we have major divide in historical texts. And now I go to my final points, the Warring States period. When we go into the Warring States period, we have a lot of interest in history. as everybody knows, Paul Goldin wrote one great article and another great article to remind us it is the norm in Chinese political discussions to utilize history, to resort to historical arguments. It was the norm back in the Warring States period. But I think that because it became the norm of the competing thinkers of the 100 schools of thought, it destroyed the reliability of historical narratives. Because the thinkers, much like the modern journalism, once newspapers told the stories in order to inform us. Now, most of the newspapers worldwide, from Global Times to Washington Post, they want to educate us. They want to teach us how to see the facts. And that is why they select the facts which fit their narratives and sometimes a little bit modify some of the facts. And sometimes they provide completely fake news. But this is very nice to educate us. And in the Warring States, we have a lot of these anecdotes. Some of them become completely detached from their historical settings, and some are semi-fictitious. You have some basic framework. Okay, we know who won whom, but why it happened. We have the stories of the Wu and Yue conflict. We have 4 different narratives. Clearly, it could not happen. 4 of them could not happen together. If one is true, 3 are wrong. But we have 4 of them, and they circulated simultaneously. What is even more interesting that we have the attrition of details. All the details which we have so much in Zhou, dates, the day of the event, these boring things which none of you who is not working on historiography is interested in. On which day did it happen? In the 15th of the month or 17th of the month? In Zhou, we have a lot of this, hundreds. When we go into Guoyu, we have a few examples. When we go into the Zhangguoce, it disappears completely. Zhangguoce is by the end of the Warring States period. It is not composed. It was composed in the Han Dynasty, but most of the composite texts come from the end of the Warring States period, and some of them even don't tell which year of the event. It is not interesting. It is not important. And then we have the master's literature, which is full of blatant anachronism and the brazen disregard for historical accuracy. And this is what I'm going to demonstrate to you in my penultimate slide. The first part I cited only in Chinese, because only in Chinese it can be understood. It is somebody who speaks to Yurang, to the great assassin retainer who is going to assassinate the prime minister of the state of Jin, Zhao Xiangzi, and he says, go to serve Xiangzi, etc., etc., etc. Now, every student of Chinese history, at least from MA on, and in China, I hope from BA on, must know that Xiangzi is not a personal name. It is a posthumous name. Only when Xiangzi is dead, you can speak about him as Xiangzi. He did not know that he is Xiangzi. Only when he dies, his descendants will call him so in this way. It is impossible, theoretically impossible, to speak about somebody, to call him by the name which could not exist during his lifetime. But it is in Liu Shichunxiu. And we have such examples elsewhere, which means that the people who composed this text and their audience, they did not bother at all whether or not the story is reliable or not. They were focused only whether it is a nice story, a good story, entertaining, moralizing, whatever, not whether or not it is reliable. And then you have the Unearthed text, another of these manuscripts, which is awfully messy, because most of the people in the pre-imperial China had 2 or 3 or 4 different names. But the authors of this text, the good ministers, they don't know, for instance, that this guy, Lord Shi, and the Duke of Shao are the same person. They don't know that Zifan and Jiufan are the same person. They simply don't know. Which means that somebody wrote the text, which was important enough for somebody else to put this text into his tome. Which means that the atmosphere of disregard of historical accuracy became the mainstream. And now I come to the afterword. My afterword is very brief. I think that from the currently available, and I emphasize twice, it is currently available materials, we can say that by the Warring States period, the informative history had become completely sidelined. It existed, but it became unimportant. And then when you want to understand the Great Revolution of Sima Qian, it was exactly that he restored the importance of narrative history. He took informative history. He took the informative history back into the picture and combined informative, didactic, and entertaining history into a single book, the first after the Zhuan. I should have finished here, but I want to contradict myself or to save you time. All my discussion is based on the currently available materials. 10 years ago, I would not be able at all to discuss what I discussed today. If in 10 years' time, we have more of these materials coming from the Warring States period, it is very much possible that I will have to revise dramatically what I have been speaking about today. But this will wait for another 10 or 15 years. And of course, all of you are welcome now to criticize, to make your comments, and to disagree.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you very much for a very wide range, as always, discussion, different sources. I will open the floor for questions and discussions. I will say something myself and then let other people comment, and people that are more knowledgeable than I. Maybe if you can, so that we have either send me a note that you want to speak and I will call on you, or just there is a function in Zoom that you can raise your hand. Otherwise, I don't see you. Maybe Yuri, maybe you stop the sharing the screen so
yes.
We can see
okay.
each other.
Okay, yes.
When I read, because Yuri sent me the paper, I read it. I was reminded of a great archaeologist in Israel, Avigad, who was in the 60s instructing people who built a model of the temple, Temple Mount, as it was during the high day of the Horde, the Horedian Temple Mount. And then after 30 years passed, at one class, his question to the student was, can you compare what I did in the model 30 years ago and what we know now from excavations around the Temple Mount and so on? So this is more or less what I feel about Yuri, that a lot of those things, because we discussed those issues for many years, already some of the ideas existed in the early work on the zhuan, but now you have more material and you can discuss it in more details and maybe have more ideas and maybe more meat to digest when you discuss those ideas. But still, let me maybe start with a kind of I don't know, more general question. It is whether your perspective is also not a little bit anachronistic. What you expect from history to be, what you expect from, or comparing those things, and basically accusing, if you will, the time of the Warring State of deteriorating their historian integrity, maybe, or something like that. But we all know that during the spring and autumn period, and maybe earlier, or at least that's what I think I know. Maybe I'm not in the loop. They didn't write it just to record history. They write a lot of the motivation behind it was reporting to the ancestors and so on. So they collected this material, but not necessarily thinking about next generation will know and so on and so forth, maybe technical things. And maybe what you see as a deterioration during the Zhou period, just because there was a proliferation, there was more writing, more different kind of writing, and we know it from the excavated texts as well. And some did continue the more earlier tradition, like the Xinian. The Xinian is from the Zhou period, and it does contain a lot of dates, as you say. So there were more, it's not that the idea of history, the idea of accurate recording disappears. There was other alternatives and more kind of hybrid manuscript, and maybe we will find something that is really like the earlier stuff, or maybe not, because reporting to the ancestors maybe become less important. So it's not about, it's my question, whether it is about the deterioration of the historic notion, or just there were more things going on, but still some continue the tradition.
Do you want me to answer immediately, or?
Yes, you can answer.
Let us, yes. First of all, you are surely possibly right, because as I told you, I work with what I have. But what is very interesting, you know, in this springs and autumns period, we have, I believe that most of Zhou come from the springs and autumns period. They have a lot of resort to history. The people who speak there, they say, as it happened in the past. Of course, they manipulate history, but somehow they are grounded in more or less what we feel, that they don't invent events too much. They may, of course, gloss over some aspects, or maybe highlight whatever is convenient for them, but fundamentally in Zhou we have this reliable, or I don't know how to call it, but I believe that it is still, you tell what more or less happened. Now, all the unearthed text, the Xinian, Chunqiu, another manuscript which was discovered archaeologically, but still not published, we have only a few words from it, discovered last year during our conference in Jerusalem. And the fourth manuscript, which was also looted and brought to the Anhui University, bought by the Anhui University. All of them, very interestingly, they are dated to the very beginning of the Warring States period, but not to the later period. So I say 1, 2, 3, 4. All of them end their stories in the 380, 390, 400 BCE. And that is why my guess that somehow around this period, something happened. It is just a guess. I completely agree with you. It is because of the proliferation of philosophical texts suddenly that maybe people lost interest in these historical texts. I believe that actually it was that before, maybe I should have modified my statement as follows, that prior to 400 BCE, when you wanted to make an argument, you made an argument by discussing something what happened in history and making your political argument. Now, the thinkers of the Warring States used much richer argumentation, and in the process, they paid much less attention to what really happened in history. And then Sima Qian, by his time already speaking politically blatant ways, was more dangerous. So it was more convenient to go back to history and to play with reliable history, but with subtle modifications. This is a guess. But I think that still something happened in the Warring States, because we now have a lot of texts. It's not only Zhou. Should it be only Zhou, I would not dare to make this lecture today. But we have now 5 or 6 texts, all of them from more or less end in 400 BC. Why? They're not coming from the same place. So it's but sure, it's a guess. I admit, but educated.
Just to add one thing, that you have to remember also that those texts are coming from graves. So maybe the question, what people took with them to the grave, not necessarily the text that existed. Why they choose? They choose those texts. They were more dramatic, maybe more interested. You're going to a long journey, maybe you take those texts with you. I don't know. But the selection is also a question. But let's open the floor for more people. Somebody wants to ask question, to comment. We are open now. Yeah, Maria?
Masha, you must open the microphone.
I will open. So Yuri, thank you very much for your talk. this is not the first time I hear you speaking about those things. We already had the chance to discuss them when you were in Munich last time. And then I noticed what you are constantly underlining, how boring those factual texts are. And I also expected what you will be underlining this today as well. So I'm not particularly convinced that these contents are necessarily boring, because even today there are quite a lot of people who are interested in such facts, when how Napoleon went out of the island of Elba, which route did he choose, on which day he went to Grenoble, and so on. So people really find those contents interesting, whereas the same people possibly are not that fascinated by moralizing lectures. So I personally will skip rather over moralizing parts of the text. So maybe this is something what you shouldn't state that kind of definitely.
Oh, Masha, you are surely right, of course, but you know, we are professional historians. So
no, I'm not speaking about professional historians, but amateurs, people who are just interested in what happened.
There also may be these amateurs who really were very much interested. They are somehow influenced by professional historians who think that it is important. And if you want to understand Napoleon's way from Elba, you need to know some working knowledge of French geography, etc. If you are now in China and you are interested in the history of Napoleon, and I think that 99.99% of Chinese have no idea where Elba is located and what was exactly the route from Elba to Paris. They want to understand how Napoleon made his comeback, but much less these details. And I think the example that I have given about the elections, when you are very much involved, and it is very important for us to understand every small detail. Yes, when you are practitioner, when you are on, when it happened during your lifetime and when it happened to you, you want to know exactly, on this day we camped in this location, because we know where this location is. And then you can evaluate. It took only 24 hours to go from the suburb of Loyang to another suburb of Loyang. However, in the Warring States period, nobody uses these texts. It is not incidental. I think in the Warring States period, we have so many historical texts, none of them, not a single one, emulates this type of narrative, because I think, did you try to teach this Chunqiu to the students? Not the students of the historiography class for advanced students, just average students, the undergrads. Teach them the Chunqiu. How long we shall survive with our class. So I think that the Chinese, educated Chinese, were more or less like our students. Everybody will love the story about the drunken Chong-er smuggled out of the state of Qi and running after his uncle with a sword and trying to kill him. This is a nice story. A story on which day it happened, I'm afraid that only professional historians or amateurs who want to become professional historians or are influenced by professional historians, they will pay attention to this.
Concerning the days, Yuri, maybe it is also worth about to think about the meanings of days, because some days are lucky, some are less lucky, and people in Warring States period, perhaps, who were using and writing all those day books, they also could be interested in days.
You are absolutely right for the beginning. The beginning, surely, the writing of the dates was for hemerological. It is clear because we have dates in the oracle bones very early. Sometimes we have their dates without months and years. So clearly it was important for the hemerology. And apropos, some of you know that I have this theory that we are now in the Gengzi year, which is an awful year because Gengzi is really awful. And if you read Zhou, Steve Durant made the great study of all the dates in Zhou. The single most hated date is Gengzi. Only 4 times it recurs, only people dying on this day. nothing good. So hemerology is very important. But yes, but again, in the Warring States period, when they narrate history, they never mention dates. Not a single Warring States period text. They make in the administrative text a lot, in the Risho a lot, but not in historical text. So something happens about the importance of the dates from the Chunqiu to the Zhang period.
Yes, anyone wants to comment on the?
Gidi, actually, there are people raising their hands. So if you look at the,
you know, there's a way to do it in I cannot see all of you together.
Maxime did it.
Oh, never mind. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, just talk.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if every one of our 71 participants start talking out all of a sudden, then it will be quite a mess.
On the bottom of the screen, just to inform you, because we are using now, there is a way to just push, and then you raise your hand, and then I see you. Then you move to the front, and I can see you. But anyhow, Maxime, talk.
Okay. Yeah, I might have missed this part of Yuri's presentation. I was actually about to ask, Yuri, what do you make of the bamboo annals?
Yes, very well. Very, very good question. Actually, I dare not make anything of the bamboo annals for one reason. Ed Shaughnessy, and I think it is his greatest study ever, the study of the bamboo annals. He convinced me. He actually disagrees with my conclusions from his book, but the moment he published the book, it is open to different conclusions. The bamboo annals which we have today are the product of revisions and editorial efforts by the literati of the Jin period. For those who don't know, bamboo annals were unearthed from the tomb, looted from the tomb in 280 CE. They were immediately attracted huge attention. But then 10 years later, there was a civil war, so the original text disappeared, and we have only two different reconstructions by two different literati of that period. And the problem that each of these reconstructions was made perhaps on the basis of their own knowledge of the transmitted texts, like we do it today. And it is not the original bamboo annals. It is not the text discovered in the tomb. It is already the product of the at least one, or sometimes or in the second instance, two different editorial efforts. So because of this, I do not consider it the original text. I use bamboo annals and only the old bamboo annals when I discuss what happened, because the event is recorded, but how it is recorded, for which audience, what was the nature of the record, because of Ed's study, which I believe that really greatest study I can imagine, I dare not going into bamboo annals in the way that Ed goes. And I think this is the greatest disagreement between me and Ed, but I always tell him that you are the master of bamboo annals. I am just a small practitioner to use your book, but I simply don't discuss them. I don't know whether they were close to the Chunqiu or not close to the Chunqiu, how much they were close, how much they differed, because the citations differ. But the citations, maybe somebody already edited, arranged, adapted. I simply don't know.
Okay, now I see. I was maybe mistaken by the way I handle it, but I see other people are raising their heads. So Noel Ann van Auken, if I pronounce correctly, you had any question?
Yeah, Noel Ann van Auken. First,
sorry, it's voice.
Is this Ed's book that you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, just happen to have it out. Yeah, you talked about the informative layers on your handout number. Sorry, here, too much paper. Handout number 3. And you referred to these as the annals draft materials.
Yes.
Yes. So I don't know if you probably haven't had time to look at my book, but in my book, I talked about those, both the negative ones and their affirmative ones that kind of match, that say, you know, so your translation, you know, this was not recorded, they did not record. There are also affirmative ones that say why they did record. And those all work together as a set. So I wonder if you have looked at those. Yes. I mean, you know, because if you have seen my book, I argue that this is a commentarial layer that was written after the Chunqiu.
You see, first of all, I utilize your book a lot, as you will see if you read my book. You are cited frequently, and I think that some 80% of your argument I accept very well. With this regard, yes, it is surely, if you consider it from the point of view of commentarial tradition, yes, I accept it. It is a kind of a Zhou hidden commentary, or but I ask the question not about this commentary, but who originally recorded these issues? Who did it? Before Zhou, before they were utilized by the Zhou. Who did it and why? And Steve Durant now has this very, very detailed discussion of all these instances of the annals, different annals in Zhou. For me, this would not be possible, would not be logical that anybody except that the same person who created the records for the annals made the records to inform other scribes. No, sorry. Don't put this type of information into the annals because this and this and this was not correct. So we don't record these things. Because you speak about the next stage. I speak about the first stage, about who made these records at the beginning in 722 BCE. Because for me, what is interesting is what was done in 722 BCE when these events were recorded. It is not post factum record.
Okay. So that's really interesting. So then you think this was kind of like a handbook telling the scribes what to write and what not to write. And I think that handbook was, I'm not convinced that that was ever written down. I do think that there were very clear rules about what could and couldn't be recorded. And that is one of the main things that distinguishes Chunqiu from the bamboo annals that we now have. But I think that these rules were lost and later needed to be understood, needed to be interpreted. So I think that's a very big difference.
This is okay, but when the rules were established, somebody, not for the official publication, had to possess a small explanation for the rules for the scribes, not for the masses, not for the interpreters of the Chunqiu. For those who make these records, when you are trained as a scribe in the state of law, and you have reports of different activities from different states, then you need to decide which of these records or which of these reports will be put into the Chunqiu and which are not. I agree with you that rules perhaps were orally transmitted, but events, you need to have also the example of events. You need to have a sample of what happened and then show, okay, here we had the event which normally we report, but because in this case, something was wrong or something was missing or something was omitted, we don't report it this time in the Chunqiu. This is my guess.
Okay, just to be clear, I didn't say the rules were orally transmitted, or I just said we don't have a written handbook. I didn't say how they were transmitted.
Okay.
Okay, just to correct
no
that.
problem.
But yeah, okay.
Okay, and I see Avital. Avital, you raised your hand.
Yes, hello. Thank you very, very much for it. It was, I really enjoyed the talk. Excuse me if it comes out as a little bit messy. It's kind of a brainstorm, a fractalic thinking of historians thinking about history, writing, historiography, you know, to be a historian thinking about historians. But I wonder whether you think we can view the Zhou as being sort of would you say that the Zhuan is an in-between stage from prescriptive, descriptive history into a history that's more interpretive or didactic? So would you see the Zhuan as such, taking actual records and then adding interpretations on them on the way to then what happens in the Warring States? Personally, the way I always imagine the Warring States is something is boiling underground, something is about to happen, a very strong feeling that something is about to change without yet knowing why. And this is why possibly the text that start, or the rhetoric that starts interesting people is what good would it do for me, or how should we govern, rather than what happened or what. So why this happened is more like what is written in these texts of the masters, but I might be mistaken. And secondly, could it be that this trend is a reason to why the transmitted texts are what survives to us, but actually I'm guessing that there were dry historical records at the time. So I'm sorry if this comes out as a bit messy again, but would you say that it's kind of just a trend of thought that then dictates both how texts are written and which texts survive throughout the ages?
Okay, let me start with the Zhuan. I hope to avoid this discussion, but if you raised it, I shall get into it. The problem that to summarize what is Zhuan about is almost impossible, because Zhuan has several completely different layers. There is the first layer, which is a pre-Zhuan. These are these local histories of different states, which were taken by the whomever composed the Zhuan and utilized to make the Zhuan the commentary on the Springs and Autumns Annals. It is number one. The second, of course, is the guy who took these materials. The guys who took these materials, they had their own ideas about what is important, what is not important, and sometimes they added their own explanations and their own interpretations and their own materials or their own direct judgments. Then there is a number three, stage number three, the transmitters. Because as you know, Zhuan was a very huge, cumbersome text, so I think there were very few samples of Zhuan. I know that Hanfeizi worked with the real Zhuan, but I don't have evidence pre-Hanfeizi. And you can then back to add a little bit, to modify a little bit, because we have some examples that there was not major restructuring, but some work on Zhuan continued for centuries. And then you have finally this guy Liu Xin, the Han archivist from the 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, who also makes a little bit of arrangements in Zhuan, as now Xu Dianwei had shown so beautifully. So when we speak about Zhuan and what Zhuan is about, it is a question of Zhuan of the 5th century BC when it started to be composed, 4th century BC, 3rd century BC, or the 1st century BC. And because of this, I try to avoid this. That is why I try to show that we need to divide Zhuan into its composite segments and to understand each segment. And each segment is also not necessarily written by the same person. And the local histories from the Chu and from the state of Zheng and from the state of Jin. Once, when I have this miracle that I can have a graduate seminar of Chinese students only on Zhuan, maybe once we shall produce a completely new view of Zhuan, because I think that we can distinguish, really, if you have a lot of time, you can distinguish different layers of each of the composite texts, because there are suddenly, and Steve Durant has now made the very great first step toward this direction. That is why I try to avoid judgment of Zhuan. Which of Zhuans or which of the segments of Zhuan you want me to discuss? For the second point, it is very close to the point of Gidi. I think that you are right. The problem of the narrative history, of the informative histories, that they don't survive very well. They don't survive. If you don't put them on the bronze, which is the major way through which we know some of segments of informative histories, like these bells from the Marquis of Jin, unless you say crazily that Confucius embedded in the Chunqiu all his great ideas, and then you need to transmit Chunqiu for 25 centuries as if it is a very important text. And unless you have the commentary on the Chunqiu like Zhou, there is no much reason to pay attention to these minute details. That is why anecdotes won, because anecdotes were nice to read, entertaining, interesting, literally appealing. But this does not mean that there was no production of informative histories. There are some traces of them from the Warring States period. What I believe that they were sidelined. They did not disappear. They just became marginal for the literati because they were the educated elite members. They wanted answers why history evolves in this way and what can we learn from this. They were much less interested in on which exact day of which exact month which army defeated other army at which exactly location.
Yes, in a way, they're more human, these anecdotes, and I guess that's why humans tended to consume them more. If I can just add one last thing, would you agree that as a historian today looking at these history, it's at least as interesting to locate the inaccuracies of history as it is to locate the accurate history?
Absolutely, absolutely. I must say that I was so delighted by discovering this stupid text, The Good Ministers, which is complete of absolute mess. I can now prove that the mess was produced in the Warring States period by the Warring States literati. Of course I like it. But it is perversion. It is something that I must cure myself out of it, of looking for anachronism and stupid mistakes in the text, which I actually do I enjoy it very much. I do it all the time.
Doing history as a form of scholarship to find these, if I'm not mistaken. But thank you very much. Sorry for it being long.
Anyone else wants to comment?
I think Guolong, I saw Guolong's hand.
Yes, please.
Hi, Yuri. Thank you very much. I think in your thinking about early Chinese historiography, do you distinguish like pure history or pure historiography versus applied history or historiography? That is, you know, let me be careful. I think that's related to the accuracy, you know, storytelling, because when something, what I think applied history or historiography is you use history or story for some religious, political, whatever purpose. So once you discover that purpose, you think, just as an inquiry, do you distinguish these two types of history or historiography? Yeah.
I try to avoid these terms because I will be in the great mess should I try to use them. I believe that the moment you write a text and transmit it to anybody, it becomes applied historiography. That is, you write it and you want that somebody reads it. You surely have some goal behind it. It may be a ritual goal, it may be religious, it may be like your analysis of the Chunqiu, to preserve the memories of these great families, the great clans, but you don't write just.
So that's related to the question of accuracy and the purpose, the ideology of, you know, these writings.
I have a feeling that at least originally, some people believed that you can write what really happened, and from this you can learn a lot. And later, when the ideological cleavages became stronger and the people became much more engaged in these intellectual debates, and you felt, I need to prove my point, you know, let us, to provoke everybody now, those who try to defend democracy now, they are coming in they are becoming weaker and weaker. And now to prove that democracy works, you need to prove, for instance, as many people want to prove, that the Second World War was won by democracies against the Nazis. Now, as a Soviet, I can tell you that it was won by the most cruel dictatorship, except for that of Adolf Hitler, by Stalin. And it is not a good lesson for history that one cruel dictatorship can destroy another cruel dictatorship. But if you want moralizing history, you will now try to gloss over Stalin and to put much more FDR and all these great champions of democracy. I think this is what happened in the Warring States period. In the Warring States period, because you wanted to prove that your point works, that morality works in politics. And other peoples like Han Feizi said, no, morality doesn't work at all. So you wanted to prove, then you had to reinvent history. Then you had to reinterpret history. Then you had to just put aside what really happened and invent events. And this is the difference which I believe. It is just a guess. Remember, it's not a real theory of myself, but my guess that what happened in the Warring States is a little bit like it happens today in certain mass media who just don't want to report about successes of bad countries and also magnify minor successes of good countries.
But Yuri, if to take your example, it's not that today nobody writes history or accurate history, whatever you say. And I think that's what happened in the Warring States. It's not that probably people didn't write it, but there was a lot of other things going on. Like today, we have a lot of other things going on, newspaper, media, internet, all those things. So that maybe the percentage of the accurate or professional history was less. And now what we find, because there was all those things, we find a lot of the other things. It doesn't necessarily say that there was no this kind of more accurate history.
I accept you. I cannot say that there was no, but I think that when we read the majority of the text, not on all the text of the Warring States period, this accurate history does not matter for them. It does not say that it did not exist. But like the journalists, they are not going, how many journalists will go to the detailed analysis of historian of the events? Very few professional journalists still will do. Most of them will take the beginning and the end of, you know what the journalist made of your analysis of the Mongol wall. You know what they wanted to have a Chinese wall, and then it became the Great Wall of China. It is not what you have written. So you see, the journalist trying to utilize historians. It is what happened in the Warring States. They did not bother with the details. It doesn't mean the details did not exist. It means that the mainstream texts paid great attention to this, less attention to this.
But also maybe I had my last thought, and it's a subject I don't understand very much about, but still ask you, maybe it's a question of authority. You know, in the Warring States, there were so many people doing different things. Then coming back to the imperial period, there was an imperial era, there was an authority, there was somebody, controlling. So it's who decide and who control and who select what is written.
It is perfect, and you have added now something which I shall put into our new collection of articles, which Martin and I and Nino Loraghi are now editing about Zhou. The authority is extremely important. Yes, you're right. When there were court scribe, he was supposedly the one who knows more or less what is history. When everybody can speak, when there was an internet and everybody, those who don't know speak, then of course the authority collapses, and then you can tell whatever narrative you want. I think that before the Warring States period, there was much more authority of the court scribes in every state. And this authority is not evident, at least, in the Warring States period. So maybe this is a very important point. So thank you very much.
Okay, Jue Guo.
Hi, Yuri, good morning, and sorry that
Good evening from Jerusalem, yes.
Yes, yeah, and this is the morning on our side, so I also apologize that I'm not really presentable. That's why I'm not turning on my video. But thank you so much for this really informative talk, and I wanted to, many of the questions I had has been sort of addressed by the previous questions. So I just wanted to ask, because your sources, particularly these activated or purportedly activated materials from the former Chu region, actually shows compared to shows a more inclination of this whether it's a preservation or preference for the what you call the informative history. I wonder if that undermines a little bit of what I think the overall trend, if we look at it from Zhuan to Shiji, that your this progression seems to work very well. But how do you explain that from Chu, from these former Chu regions that written in the Chu manuscript? I think it is a different matter whether how do we define whether they are Chu historiography or not, that kind of go against a little bit of this trend that you presented that seems to characterize what this anti-informative turn in the warring states. I wonder, one thing to consider maybe is the regional difference. I think that whether or not we are considering, or in your definition of the Zhou historiography has always been from the northern perspectives, that that to put Chu there, I think it's tentative, right? Because we knew very little about Chu, but then archaeology really overwhelmingly shows what Chu was from their contemporaneous records, contrast to the northern ones were largely transmitted, maybe with the exception of Zhou Xinian, that its nature is just too complicated to really be put into the consideration. So I guess my question is, how do we explain these activated materials that do not completely support your theory about this overall trend?
Actually, I thought that these materials do support, because my theory is based on these materials precisely. I don't think that there is a narrative, a progression from Zhuan to Shiji. I think there is a dialectics. There is a Zhuan type of history. It becomes marginalized. It does not disappear, but it is marginalized in the warring states, and then it is resurrected by the Shiji. So it's not a progression. It is a kind of negation of negation. Let me use the great Marxist dialectics for the Marxist friends here in the audience. As for Chu, you're absolutely right. And as you know very well, I have also addressed this issue of the local identity of Chu, whether or not it is seen, whether or not it is a different cultural entity as we see it from the historical, from this bamboo text, historical, quasi-historical text from the state of Chu. It is a fascinating question because in my eyes, I cannot discover any fundamentally different of Chu historiography from, for instance, Jin historiography, which is preserved, A, in the Zhuan, B, in Xinian, which is composed in the state of Chu, but still utilizes a lot of Jin materials. I don't believe there were dramatic regional differences in terms of historiography. I believe that for the literati, for the Wenren, there was the common ideas, the common values, the common norms, which does not mean that there was no different Chu identity. There was different Chu identity on different social levels. Gidi and I wrote this about Qin identity, and of course, Gidi is a specialist. I have just provided materials of this analysis of different social strata have different ideas of their local identity, but history, as much as we know, as much as we can guess, was utilized, read, produced by the members of the Shi stratum of the so-called intellectuals, and they were of the same culture or the same fundamentally culture in Chu, Jin, Lu, Qi, and even Qin. Perhaps sometimes separated, but more often than not, I cannot say that these materials are something which can exist only in the state of Chu and not elsewhere. Of course, two of the Chu manuscripts are still not published, so we shall wait for their publication. Unfortunately, it will take another 7 or 8 years, as far as my friends in China tell me. But when they are published, maybe you will destroy my arguments and trample on me completely. However, insofar as I use this Xinian and Chunqiu, I don't think that it is dramatically different. I think that these are exactly parts of the story.
No, I think you are right. And you did that comparison using from the linguistics point of view to talk about the reliability or authenticity of Xinian. I think that work was really solid. But just based on what you showed us, actually, a brilliant comparison between the what you call the Jin history preserved in Zhuan, and then the same events and being narrated in the Xinian, that I agree that either they had shared common sources, but wouldn't that the way they narrated differently, in other words, that you showed so strikingly that Xinian wasn't really interested in those very juicy narrative details, but get to the core of the information. And I think that your hypothesis about their function as diplomatic kind of briefing books, I find that is really intriguing. But that doesn't, that address part of the differences, but the other part would be this historiographical differences. In other words, that what choose to be recorded, what be considered as the importance for history writing does show difference. So that's where where my question came from. In other words, that was, whether you call it true historiography or not, maybe we could say the different region-based historiography. But overall, that would question, at least put your, I think, Zhou historiography, which would be your premise that all the elite members of each state would participate in that discourse. But I think that the Xinian and just your comparison somehow pose a question about at least the possibility of that Chu chose a different perspective and chose different kinds of information. So I'm just—
Believe me that I shall be most fascinated. I shall be most fascinated if you are right. I tried to find this local Chu flavor. I failed until now. But when you talk, it reminds me that I promised to my friends in Tsinghua, and maybe we shall do it with Renda and with several universities, to make a group of students to divide Zhuan into segments according to the states, and then to try to see whether the narrative from different states have some differences in their mode of narration, in their angles. It is a huge work. That is why I need a great student team. I cannot do it alone. I'm already too old for this. But
I think that's a fantastic idea. That if we can down, because I totally agree with you about not to have this one model fits all. I think that's definitely a much more productive approach. So if we are doing this with the true manuscripts, I think maybe we should do that with Zhuan as well. And that's definitely a great idea. Thank you, Yuri.
Okay, I think we are over 1 hour and a half. We have a very comprehensive discussion and talk, and I would like to thank Yuri again and thank all of you for participating. And Danny had to leave, so I don't know what's the next talk, but hopefully you will join the other talks of our seminar as well. So thank you, Yuri.
And thank you all for coming. It was just, I am so much impressed by your participation and so many friends from all parts of the world. So long live Zoom.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Gidi, sorry, may I just make an announcement for this distinguished group, because we are going to host a seminar in several weeks on December 10. Michael Nyland is going to give a talk on the Shanshu. And I will inform about it in a few days. So I will send some emails also via the Sinology Clearinghouse and so on. I posted on Facebook, but please just save the date. It will be about the same time, 4 p.m. Central European time. So what participants both not only in Europe but also in America and China will be able to participate. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.